We're back inside for a little bit. It's a little cloudy, a little chilly out by the pool today. So I wanted to bring it inside. All the last video, all the talks about the cold, man, you know. Man, if I can be in a comfortable environment, I don't choose to haze myself. But this video is not about the cold. Recently, I've been thinking about leadership. Specifically, what my experience was like with leadership in the SEAL teams and leadership in the French Foreign Legion. Man, I could go into volumes of information over almost half a decade I was there between the two, right? It was 11 and a half years between the two in the SEAL teams and the French Foreign Legion. Man, and people in the peanut gallery who be talking smack about, man, I spent 11 and a half years, man, in both institutions, in both communities. Some people don't understand that. 11 and a half years is a good amount of time to get some good information, be able to compare the two. I'll tell you. First of all, one has to understand the completely different philosophical approaches of each community. Right? And I know for the people that are going to comment, I understand that the SEALs are a special force unit and the Legion is a highly trained infantry unit. But we're comparing the two, so we have to compare the two, right? In the SEAL teams, the leadership, the officer class, and even the NCOs are pretty damn high caliber. You got guys, top performers out of the Naval Academy, some even from West Point, top performers. People don't know, there is a couple cross decks from West Point into the SEAL teams, right? They have to do a green to blue, so they do a one-to-one swap. Kind of an interesting thing, but I digress. And they have a very long leadership pipeline, a very involved, a heavy screening process. So by the time those guys get to the SEAL teams, not to mention the unbelievably fantastic heritage of the officer class going through buds with the enlisted guys. The same training, the same crucible that the enlisted guys are going through, the officers go through. And also, when the officers show up to the platoon, man, they're cleaning trucks. They're cleaning weapons. They're doing all this extra side duties that the enlisted guys are doing. They're slanging an A-dub at times. So there's a bond that's created that kind of develops with a mutual respect. You're all in the same boat. There's also obviously a little differentiation in the responsibilities that are given to the officers, the junior officers, but it creates a very, very solid atmosphere. The ambiance is very good in the SEAL teams regarding. So also, ownership is pushed up and pushed down. Debriefs, which I had mentioned before on an earlier video about SEALs versus Legion versus SEALs, is on debriefs. Ownership is coveted, mandatory even. If in a debrief they hear anybody putting blame on anybody else, you are going to get smashed. It's always your fault. And the next guy up, it's always his fault. And that's said out loud. You'll hear in debriefs, that was my bad. I didn't communicate this clearly. I did this. Here's where I failed. Now let's shift gears into the French Foreign Legion. Now, those officers, it's a completely different ball game because those officers are coming out of Saint-Cyr, right? The academy in France. It's kind of like their West Point. And those guys are going through a very similar pipeline in terms of leadership and all. I'm not too well read in on what exactly the French officers are going through, but I'm sure it's all the same leadership stuff, or maybe it's not, right? Because how it works when those officers graduate, it's kind of a feather in the cap for a French officer to go to the French Foreign Legion. Right? It's kind of sexy. It's different. You're working with foreigners. They usually go to the Legion and then they'll go back. They'll do a disassociated at the Foreign Legion and then go back to some regular French military unit. But a tour in the French Foreign Legion is coveted, and it's because it's hard. It's a hard day-to-day life, and they're living it too. Now, let's shed some light on the environment, what that creates. You have French officers. A lot of them are from the aristocracy of France. Like a lot of these families have old castles, and this military family heritage is rolled in from the old marshals of Napoleon, that type of thing. It's very pomp and circumstance. The French really love their formal salutes, and they march around, and it's like a dun dun da da every Monday, and you're very formal, dog and ponies all the time. And the enlisted guys are all foreigners, or near all foreigners. So now this creates a little bit of separation. So the most important issue here is the language barrier. You have French, formal francophones, French speakers, who are speaking and dealing with a bunch of knuckle draggers like me, whose French is terrible, whose accents are from California, straight butcher French, and they just cringe. Man, it just don't work with the California shock and the gnar accent. So there's communication issues. That creates some friction. Now, even the NCOs and people that are in the Legion longer, their French obviously gets better and they're more fluent, but there's still that you're a foreigner, you're not even French type situation. It's also an organization that's very, very top down. And like I said, I understand why they're pulling all these rough guys together, trying to pull all these different nationalities and experiences and ages into this cohesive fighting unit. So the discipline is strict. They're very, very top down, and they don't want that thinking shooter. They want you to shut up and charge the machine gun nest. That's how the Foreign Legion is. And that creates some friction, right? Obviously. The enlisted guys they don't have that good bond. You don't go through the French officers technically aren't really legionnaires. They didn't go through Legion selection. They didn't do their white Kepi Blanc march and the farm and all those things. So there's not that shared hardship, which is so important for bonding, like the Spartans did. And that shared hardship is what creates bonds in any community. Right? It could be a firefighter, law enforcement, any military unit. How do you bond? You bond with those tough times, right? Guys working in force are cold. We talked about the cold. Man, what that shared suffering, and more importantly, getting through it together, what that creates. There is good moments, but there's always some slight, you don't get too chummy. You don't get too chummy with the leadership because the culture's tight, and if you get a little too chummy and you step over the line, boom, you're going to get slammed with stacking rocks in the pyramids, right? Or weeding or whatever. The leadership also is, now let's talk specifically about NCOs. The guys that stay in the Legion are tough. They're not and they come from tough lives. Their options are the Legion. It's their best option, and that's what they want to stay in. So some of them feel like they're stuck or they have to be there. And it's a tough life. It's not a lot of laughs, not a lot of chummy times, and you're busy as shit and always with the Legion, right? Even like I said, on Christmas Eve, you're there. It's tough. Creates a very stark environment. So the leadership is tough, and they push that environment out. And because the discipline's so tight in the Legion, the ownership piece is a little bit lacking. The French officers definitely aren't going to show weakness in front of the foreigners and, the lowly legionnaires. They're not going to be like, yeah, I fucked that up. That is just non-existent in the French Foreign Legion. Debriefs, I don't even think one time I heard anybody take response, even debriefed on anything about mistakes that were made. And that also could be some of the communication problem that has, for 200 years, they just don't debrief because they assume people aren't really going to understand all the debrief anyway. The ownership piece is, if it is done, it's done out of sight of the legionnaires, the MDR, the militaire du rang, the rank and file military. So those debriefs happen with the NCOs and the officers. I'm sure some type of ownership, but it's not seen by me or the other rank and file enlisted guys. So the leadership I experienced there is, what's the most important piece to take from this is the most important part of leadership is ownership. If you're at a company, you're a manager, or you're a CEO or anything, the most glaring issue I've ever seen regarding problems with leadership is lack of ownership. Is lack of, one loses respect for somebody that doesn't take ownership. We all know that, even in relationships, man. If somebody doesn't say, yeah, I fucked up and I'm not going to do that again, right? And they just they don't say that and they don't address it. Man, you feel there's something missing. There's knowledge there's wisdom that wasn't taken or you don't understand if they got it or not. It's so important is the ownership piece. Now, in terms of competency, right? Won't get too much into that because I understand. The SEALs was special forces, right? The selection was a lot harder. And in the Foreign Legion, the competency levels is just going to be different. The skill sets are going to be not as high because they didn't have millions of dollars pumped into them in shooting and all this stuff and tactics. Now, I will say, I don't like to just sit here and shit on anything because I had a couple really good officers in the Foreign Legion. One of them happened to die in the mountains. It was a shame. He was a really good officer. Actually came from French Special Forces, so just to give you that piece. Super strong, very good in the mountains, and he died from collapsing rocks. Kind of a shame. And his wife was actually, associated with the Legion and actually did a lot of physical therapy and stuff with the Legionnaires. So that was kind of a tight, unfortunate incident, right? They had a couple kids and, my love and prayers go out to them and her. So that was a guy that always took ownership and always explained things also, right? You don't need to explain every move. You don't need to telegraph every move to your people. Sometimes you got to set the tone and the mission. But what I've seen in my experience, man, a magnificent leader breaks down, hey, here's the game plan, and here's what I'm thinking, and here's the why, right? Don't need to explain all the time the why. A brief, 1 minute why. This is how I'm thinking. This is the intent. This is the mission, and this is kind of the rooted line of thought of why. That helps because it brings people in the fold. It empowers people. Also empower your people, right? You don't need to micromanage. Empower. A great leader creates leaders, not followers. That's the biggest takeaway. The greatest leaders create other leaders around them. Approach your business, your life, your family that way, and you're going to be crushing it. Be smart.